Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to today's session on optimizing forest carbon policy in Asia, supporting NDCs, and attracting investment. As we know, nature plays a huge role, or will play a huge role, in delivering climate targets. I think delivering on Paris will be impossible without a significant contribution from nature. But for that to happen, there needs to be a significant ramp-up in investment in forestry protection and in other forms of nature around the world. And on the one hand, protecting forestry, investing into nature can bring lots of benefits. Obviously, it can deliver huge emissions reductions. It can also deliver other co-benefits, biodiversity benefits, ecosystem services, employment benefits. So on the one hand, there's a potential here for sort of a win-win scenario, both for governments and private sector operating in the forestry space. But if it was that simple, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. We know that forest land is under a lot of pressure from other sectors, timber, resource extraction, other forms of competition, agriculture in particular. So protecting forestry, delivering emissions reductions is not an easy task. And there are lots of options available to governments and the private sector. We're going to discuss some of those options today and think about what methods work well, what are the barriers to investment, how we can overcome them, how we can scale up investment, and how we can maximize the potential of forests in carbon reduction. And to discuss this topic with me, we've got an excellent panel. So we have Dorji Sun, founder and CEO of Bioeconomy; Leslie Dershinger, founder and CEO of Terra Global; Jerome Cochet, co-founder and managing director of Good Carbon; Dr. Nobuto Yasui, COO of Sustainacraft; and Brian McCann, director at Climate Impact X. So I wanted to start, Leslie, with you. I mean, maybe you could start by saying a little bit about Terra Global, but also I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on some of the challenges you encounter on deploying finance at scale in some of the projects you're involved in around the world, and you know, thinking about what those challenges are, and maybe touching just in your intro comments on potential solutions or potential ways around those challenges.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you for having us on the panel. And what a great turnout, 600 people here in Singapore. The last time I was here was right before COVID, so it's nice to be back. Terra Global is a woman-run organization. We were founded in 2006, and we've been focused entirely in what we now call nature-based solutions, a nice acronym. You can even say it at a cocktail party. And we have, since our founding, our mission has been to attract private sector capital to promote nature-based solutions across the spectrum of everything from avoided deforestation all the way through improved agricultural practices. We provide both technical support for the development of high-quality, multiple benefit emission reductions and removals, and we have an investment pool that channels capital to finance projects over the long term with private sector climate finance. So it's a little bit about Terra. To your question, I think one of the things, you know, our pool is a global pool in developing and emerging economies, and what's both exciting but also a bit scary when you're deploying, you know, real investment dollars is, you know, what kind of uncertainty, what kind of certainty do you have in each of the countries you're looking at making an investment? So, as you can imagine, when you have an investment where the repayment is in carbon credits, generally, that's the primary repayment, one of the most important things is being able to secure that carbon tenure. So when we look at countries that have either no laws, which is sometimes actually a good thing, or emerging laws where you have things that are on the books or that you've heard of, you may even have a draft, or have existing laws, we have to navigate that. And the things we look at are, you know, how can you secure carbon tenure? Will the laws potentially take your carbon tenure after you've made an investment? Do they limit your right to sell? So for example, in Zambia, all sales, on their carbon, with their carbon law, go through the government, and just like cocoa in some of the West African countries. What kind of registration requirements will there be? Are they things that can easily be done alongside of what you're doing for registering under a standard? We also look at, is there an impact on the greenhouse gas projections that you have? So for example, in Colombia, you have, you can use the VCS. Great, as long as you know how to use the VCS and you can navigate the changes that are upcoming there. You will also see that there is what's called a maximum mitigation potential. So in Colombia, the regs there have this specification that the most you can ever get, at least from deforestation, are linked to their FREL. So you may have seen that your area has, I don't know, a % deforestation, but if the FREL, when it gets allocated by ecoregion, only allocates you 39 basis points, you have a third of the baseline you thought. So looking at how the regulations and decrees in a country might impact your greenhouse gas quantification. And then I think we'll talk about it more, but also importantly, how will the country, our goal is to attract finance, particularly focused now and over the next number of years for countries that have conditional NDCs that need funding. So to the extent that when we go in and finance a project or a program, the credits for us will stay in the country. So it's quite important that you understand how that can be done in the country. Maybe there's no regulation on that, and maybe there is, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. One other thing is also when there's a domestic program, Simon knows this well because he works a lot around the world on emerging domestic programs, how might the credits that you would be generating to repay the finance, which may be done on an international standard like Vera, how might there be either competing demand or conflicting demand from a domestic program, or maybe complementary demand? So again, not to bring up Colombia a million times, but in Colombia, there's a tax and credit system. The tax is somewhere around, I don't know, $5.50. So anybody that's domestically wants to use an offset to get out of their tax obligation is only going to pay maximum of $5.50 or whatever the number is now. It goes up every year. But our international voluntary market pays twice that much, sometimes 3 times that much. So just being able to navigate all those things is a really both exciting but challenging way in which we look at deploying capital. Hopefully that answered a few of your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. That was great. And I want to come to Dorji next on a similar question, and also touching on some of those emerging markets that Leslie asked. But actually, Leslie, I just wanted a quick clarification. Carbon tenure, can you briefly explain what you mean by that and why it's important?
Yeah, for those of us that have worked in developing and emerging economies, the concept of land tenure versus land ownership is quite common to us. We know that because very few countries can you actually own land. But there are many systems that provide land tenure, so clear laws that support someone's ability to be on that land and to use the natural resources there. So you extend that to carbon tenure. It's the same thing, which is if you're doing something on that land that uses those natural resources in a different way that produces a carbon asset, will those land tenure holders be recognized as the carbon tenure holders, or will somehow the government through regulation say, actually, no, we own all the carbon. It is no longer the 10-year holders. So it's the ability to deliver, and are you contracting with whatever entity will ultimately have the right to that asset. And to that point, we use what we call a belt and suspenders approach, right? Anybody that we think might have a claim to carbon, we try to get them as part of our agreement. And even if it's not the government, we'll seek to get, at minimum, a no objection, which becomes, it's a challenge. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. So Dorji, I mean, a similar question to you on the challenges you face in putting climate finance to work. But it was also, Leslie touched on some of the emerging markets that we see in the region, and I know you're based here in Singapore. So we see Singapore opening up its carbon tax to the use of credits. We hear of positive noises from Indonesia around carbon pricing, Malaysia as well, moving ahead with a sort of a voluntary scheme. Do you see good opportunities coming in the region to create demand for nature-based carbon credits and an avenue to deploy more capital?
Excellent question. First of all, good morning, everybody. My name is Dorji. I actually first started in carbon around the same time as Leslie. I think we were together at COP13 2007, just going back now 16 years, 15, 16 years. And so, Simon, your question has many layers to it. And first of all, background on bioeconomy. I started carbon conservation in 2007 because the idea was carbon finance conservation. And our first project was with Rio Tinto Aluminium. It was in Queensland, Australia, and we were able to avoid deforestation, and it was under greenhouse friendlies. I still remember we sent a spreadsheet of unique codes and then received the financing in exchange for that. This was going back to ancient times. So this was before Vera even existed, before there were methodologies. We were figuring out risk management buffers back in the day. And then from there, though, you start realizing that actually it's biodiversity, there's biogenomic value, there's pharmaceutical plant medicine, there's ethnobotany, there's water, there's rain. There's just so much value. That's why we decided actually what's more appropriate is the biodiverse, biogenomic, the bioeconomy, bio meaning life, so the living economy. And so our hope is carbon is the first cab off the rank, but that there are going to be many, many, many other revenue streams, because these are just treasure troves of 4 billion years of DNA and evolutionary magic, and we're just kind of burning it for beef burgers. So just coming back, I think going back to first principles, we are so far from what is necessary to stop catastrophic climate change, and in fact, history may show that we've already passed tipping points. But going back to '92 when there was the Earth Summit, everyone knows that there is still 7 billion tons a year being released by deforestation. So when you start from that, and the way I see deforestation is if we can buy 10 years, 20 years by putting finance urgently into stopping this deforestation, finding alternative ways for communities to earn a living, then that at least buys us the time for CCS technology, for direct air capture, direct ocean capture, energy transition. It buys us 3 decades. I almost call them like, how do we buy time till 2050 for the rest of the de-weaning of fossil fuels to catch up? So the elephant in the room, just starting from the very, very top, is that 40 billion tons a year being released, aiming for net zero. What we're talking about retirements in the hundreds of millions is not even 1%. It's such a fraction that all of this, integrity hawks, all of these rules, all of these challenges, all it is doing is stifling the market. So from a big level, there was a front page from The Economist which said ESG, and it had scissors cutting the E and just saying, if you want to stop catastrophic climate change, we got to just stop emissions. It's just about stopping carbon. And of course, there are all of the co-benefits, and that's important. And then you layer that on, fantastic, but it shouldn't stifle the fundamental need for demand to be 1,000x, what it is. So coming back to your question, the opportunities we see, so obviously there is going to be a few vectors of determining that. Ultimately, it comes down to what is the risk and return for $1 to be deployed into a certain project. So as an example, we looked at a project in Cambodia. It was an amazing project. The challenge was it had 200,000 people living in the vicinity in the areas. So the challenges with community engagement to stop these, and there were so many fronts of deforestation, it was incredibly difficult for us to convincingly know that we could deploy a program that could engage so many people to stop that deforestation. Then the second element we looked at was what is the carbon density? What is the additionality? So clearly there was a lot of threat. But the carbon density of the forest was not like a peat forest. Peat forests have deep peat. They call them carbon bombs, because once they drain, once they have started oxidizing, then you start getting the fire risk. The amount of carbon that could be released is tremendous, including NO3, including methane as well. So there's different types of amounts of carbon. And then when you layer on top of that, now to your question as well on policy, there's different jurisdictions. States may support, so we started off at a state level because national levels weren't working as fast as the state levels, but then national is now requiring national registries, national engagement, etc. And then of course there's always the local communities. So just to chime in with what Leslie has said, I think we're in 2022. scientists are saying we're going to cross 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement, in 9 years, right? Now the question just is there an urgent way that we can bring to bear some type of scalable platform? And my only concern, and I'll put this to the rest of the panel, is we're introducing more and more dimensions of complexity, and now it's causing greater and greater confusion and deterrence from the buying side, the demand side. And so even though this panel is mostly focused on the supply and the policies, and I'm happy to speak more about Indonesia and some of the countries we operate in Africa, I just would like to turn it to the audience. This is largely an investment and trading forum. If there are people here who, hand on heart, think that there is a way that they could 10x their retirements and 10x their spending, you should be actually dictating, I think, to supply, as opposed to some of the integrity councils that are coming up with incredibly complex compliance requirements. But that is my way of answering, but not answering in the way of Chi. But thank you very much.
No, that's great, and I think that gives us some topics for conversation in the next 45 minutes. Yeah, lots of things there actually that I think we're going to dig into. But I wanted to come to Jerome next, and slightly following on from Dorji's point about massively ramping up investment. I know you are on the investment side of things, and you have an innovative business model to try to bring new finance into this space. Could you say a bit about what your company does and challenges you see in growing investment by 10x, 100x?
Yeah, absolutely. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for having us. I have to say we are relatively new to that business, and COP13 I only know from TV back then. But what brings us here in the first place is an experience which I personally had in Costa Rica a couple of years ago, where I spent vacation on the Osa Peninsula, if you know that place. And there was a fantastic hotel, which is, sustainable tourism in the middle of really nowhere. And this lady who was running the hotel, she was trying to raise 7 million euros, or dollars in that case, to protect the first generation and second generation forest, which was, by the way, partly really, with new species and biodiversity, to protect it from deforestation. Yeah? And those 7 million euros she didn't manage to raise. I think she was, after a couple of years, only at 500-something thousand, right? And that was, to a certain extent, the situation which gave the sparking of the idea of creating a platform which I guess addresses the need which many of you in the room also face, whether it's 7 million, 70 million or 700 million, how we can essentially raise money to protect and restore nature. So what we are doing is we are offering what we call Nature as a Service platform, which connects project developers to companies who are willing to invest into restoring nature to have the triple effect, the climate impact, nature impact, and also social impact. And to make it very basically simple, is what we do is we tokenize nature, or we make nature easily investable. So what we try to do is to make something illiquid, which is often the case, and clunky to transact, very easy to transact almost with the click of a button. So we have created a technical platform on which a company can easily build a long-term climate action portfolio from a diverse set of projects globally. And all those projects are vetted and pre-assessed from us, so that we can ensure that it really delivers a triple impact across these three dimensions. And back to your question, so we are live in Europe, and we are addressing ourselves with the projects which we have on the platform to corporates. So to big corporates, which are publicly listed companies, but which are also private big companies, and they ask us very simple questions, right, when they look at a project. Number one, will the carbon credits which I'm going to buy as a company today, and which will, along the contracts from the platform, only be delivered in 5 years' time, will I still own them in 5 years' time? So this entire Article 6 basically a discussion, and whether a country can make a strong commitment how they deal with corresponding adjustments. Yeah? And we have to build up carbon policy almost to advise companies in which countries they should invest and which countries they shouldn't, right? Because on a very high level, they look at the world and say, these are the countries I don't want to invest because the risk is too big. So that's point number one, which could fuel capital massively into countries by making a statement from a policy perspective. Number two, I think it's about de-risking, right? So companies, you know, they have no clue about nature, at least most companies, and providing the ability to de-risk an investment, you can do that in various manners. You can de-risk your own investment and spread it across different projects. That's essentially what we offer. So we fractionalize the ownership in those projects and give companies the ability to build a portfolio. But countries can also do something on their own, which is essentially public-private partnerships where they can show skin in the game by investing into the project themselves. And you know, that shows, A, that land tenure and land ownership is clarified, right, in the first place, which has been a concern on many fronts. And obviously that there's also strong public support for those projects. And I think what just happened in Indonesia, it's outside nature now, but I think it's a strong signal and a strong role model. And I think the last bit, point number three, is to have a national registry so that the carbon credits which are increasingly issued by national, you know, standards are also ones which can be exported to other countries under Article 6, and which also have basically the you know, the how do you say, the that they're recognized also for carbon offsetting under Paris Agreement. Yeah, so three very concrete things which all lead to a de-risking of investment, which is eventually what companies are looking for.
Thanks, Jerome. That's great. So, Nobuto, I wanted to come to you next. And to date, the voluntary market has been a key source of, or a key method to deploy capital into nature restoration and protection. And I tend to think of the key sources of demand in the voluntary market being in Europe and North America. But Japan, you know, is emerging as a new center of demand, and I guess there's huge potential for voluntary activity in Japan, given the size of the country and the wealth of the economy. Can you say a few words about what sort of activity you're seeing in the Japanese voluntary market? And do you see potential for growth?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Good morning. My name is Nobuto, CEO of Sustainacross, Tokyo-based rating agencies. Established in 2021, just 1 year back. So let me describe a little bit about the context of why we're starting these businesses in Tokyo. So yeah, you're right, Simon. I think there are increasing amount of interest over the voluntary carbon credit in Japan, but because of some news articles published in 2021 and 2022, I think people get very much conscious and anxious about the quality of verified carbon credit. So that's where we are starting our businesses from, because I think they need additional confidence, additional due diligence for the verified carbon credit. So that's why we started our businesses. And yeah, so that's a frequently asked question, why Japanese companies are very much careful about choosing the voluntary carbon credit, and why it takes a lot of time for them to decide purchasing voluntary carbon credit, right? So let us share some of my thoughts based on my daily conversation with Japanese company and Asian company. So there are future that I have to highlight, which is about okay, one thing. So how should I using that voluntary carbon credit for? That's a common asked question across the globe, right? When another I think frequent asked question in Japan is how should I communicating this quality of the carbon credit with our stakeholders, right? So that's kind of the nature of, I'm not sure, I do not done any precise comparison between the countries, but I think they try to spend a lot of time on digesting the theory and the science underneath of the nature-based solution. And it takes a lot of time on, right? So, and another thing is because of the booming of the voluntary carbon credit, a lot of newcomers entering this field in Japan. So they need a lot more learning time, right, to be ready to talk about or digest what's going on in the voluntary carbon market. So actually that's the status. I think at the moment, I think what I've seen in the market is they're trying to spend a lot of effort in that, preparing for the booming voluntary carbon market. So I think it may take some more time, but I think they're trying to do that. So that's what I can share with you.
Thanks, that's great. And you touched on issues of quality and the need to take time to make decisions. And I want to come back to that because it's sort of, there's a natural conflict here between the points you've raised and Dorji's points about needing to go much quicker and much faster. But I wanted to come to Brian next. And Brian, one of the barriers to investment we see in the voluntary market is a lack of transparency over price. I think a lack of understanding of the drivers of price, why there's different prices, even what a benchmark price is. Can you say a bit about what Climate Impact X is doing to bring transparency to pricing in the voluntary market, and the impact that's having through your platform, whether that's driving new sources of finance into the market?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here. For a bit of background, Climate Impact X is a marketplace and exchange for high-quality carbon credits. We were launched last year, backed by Temasek, DBS Bank, the Singapore Exchange, and Standard Chartered. And really our goal as an organization is to help scale the voluntary carbon market. And exactly as you say, bringing transparency and quality to the market, both giving companies a place to transact with confidence, but also helping to shed a light and create more clear prices in a way that can both help support further investment decisions or make sure the communities that are ultimately impacted by the work that we all do here, that they know that they're getting a fair deal. And I think the ultimate sort of question for that is, what was the price of a carbon credit yesterday? And there's probably 80 people in the room, and we could get 100 answers, maybe. So the work that we do around scaling price transparency is twofold. One is at the end of Q1 of next year, we'll be launching a spot platform that'll have a standardized contracts of forest-based projects that we hope is more reflective of the market as a whole. I won't get too much into that today because we have a panel session on that you should all go to later on in the afternoon. But the other platform that we have is an auction facility. And because ultimately where the market is today and where it will likely continue to be is that it's less reflective of other commodities, other sort of homogeneous commodities like gold, and it's closer to wine or used cars, where ultimately every project is different, every region is different, and the prices are going to be different. And so the best way to figure out the price of something is you get a bunch of people in the room, ask them what they're willing to pay, and have a market clearing price on that basis. And having auctions that are structured in a way that can create clear prices is ultimately the best way to do that, recognizing that each project is different. And so to take an example, we ran our second auction 3 weeks ago for the Delta Blue Mangrove project in Pakistan, which had a clearing price of $27.80 for 250,000 tons transacted that day. And so what that does is moreover is that the bids and the information that went into getting to that price, all of that is now public. And so we now know that somebody somewhere wanted to buy 10,000 tons for $50, and a lot of people wanted to buy 30% of the bids were for $35 or above. And so now for every other blue carbon mangrove removal project, if you're looking to either make an investment decision of should I go and scale this thing up, should I go and put $1 million into this, what's my return, how can you make an investment, all of these numbers now exist and all of these prices are now available. And moreover, the 36,000 people that live in the region impacted by the project, when they look to see the benefits sharing that they're getting, the financial returns and the support that they're getting through the project, they can look and they can see, well, this is the price that was paid, this is the portion that I'm getting. They can more or less know that that's fair, which creates more confidence in all of the work that we're trying to do. Because the opposite of that is, over the summer, there was a story of a a large energy company in Latin America that had agreed a long-term offtake for, I think it was $4 a ton with a community. And then now that the market's much higher, the prices are different. And so there was a bit of backlash against where did that number come from, how is it happening, to the point where the president is now stepped in, there's a national commission. And so talking about the policy uncertainty that Dorji mentioned and the complexities of navigating these geographies, the more confidence that can be created through clear pricing is how you can bring along communities, regulators, governments, but it all stems from making sure that everybody involved gets a fair deal.
Thanks, Brian. So I think from those comments, there's a few interesting points I think emerge, and natural sort of conflicts almost. Yeah, on the one hand, thanks, I'm dropping my pen. Dorji has highlighted the fact that we need to move much faster, we need to scale investment, and we need to deliver much higher volume of emissions reductions. So that, on the one hand, suggests we need to simplify arrangements, standardize the market to make nature-based carbon a truly investable asset. But on the other hand, we also need to address concerns over integrity, and we also need to address policy complexity. And looking at arrangements under the Paris Agreement, domestic policy, it feels that policy is only getting more complicated. But let's look at the integrity, look at the balance between needing to simplify arrangements but address integrity. And Leslie, I was hoping to come to you on this one. What are the quick wins here? I mean, we have things like the Integrity Council that Dorji mentioned, which is good ambitions but highly complicated process. Are there quicker methods we can deploy that raise integrity without adding huge layers of complexity?
Great question. And integrity, I know at IETA is one of the main components. Also, I think integrity in deal structures and pricing is absolutely necessary for the long-term viability of investing in nature-based solutions. If we see, which we have seen and hopefully will not see as much, deals that don't find a fair risk-return balance between those people that have a high degree of knowledge on financial structuring and financing with those that often don't, we're going to get into really, it's going to be a disaster. There's no quick fix. Those of us that are working in the market are, those that have to bring the integrity. I think the ways we do that is deals need to be priced as indexed to the market. I think a year ago we could never have even done that because we didn't have enough pricing data. And that's where it's really nice to see additional platforms coming online, whether they're spot transactions or auction pricing, that give us more data so that when we actually structure our financing terms, they can be based on a spread to market. And hopefully that's a fair spread. I think that transparency and price discovery is critical. I know you might be not interpreting what Dorji is saying the way he meant it, because I don't think you're talking about commoditization of nature-based credits, right? Because the fact that coffee isn't one price, right? You have really high quality coffee that's going to cost more. You've got the monkey digested coffee that costs $1,000 a kilogram, right? So
Civet cat.
What?
It's civet.
Civet. Yeah, one of those guys. Yeah, of course you'd know that, right?
That's all I drink.
Yeah, but I guess the point is that we and everyone's so worried about fragmentation, but fragmentation to some extent is just the nature of what we do. So anyway, I guess my point is to promote integrity, it's got to come from within. Having things like multiple access to pricing is at spot level is really, really important. And I truly believe that someone somewhere at the standards should require full disclosure of financial terms. We'd put our financial terms out there, but we're not going to be the only one to do it so that we can be bid against. But if all of a sudden, the Integrity Council is going to take forever to get their act together. But if all of a sudden it said you actually had to put these financial terms out there where the money's going, then all of a sudden people can't rip off communities. So, I don't know.
Yeah, but, so first of all, when you think about it from we've got a question as well from the back. So just first of all, when you approach it from a supply side, just to give you an example, so we have a large-scale project in Indonesia. It came through the forestry ministry, so you have to have the legal rights at that point. You then have to go through a very rigorous FPIC process, free, prior, informed consent with all of the communities. You also have to have gubernatorial or governor at least awareness and knowledge. And then you have to get the permits to support if it was previously being used for forestry or plantation or agriculture, to have that shifted to no longer producing that potential revenue from a tax perspective and then shifted to carbon. And then you have the new carbon laws which have been drafted, are in process of being finalized and passed. But again, that has different types of implications around needing to be measured against Indonesia's forestry NDCs, and then whether or not there's a surplus credit or not, and then being able to know whether you can sell that internationally with a corresponding adjustment or not as an ITMO or not. And so just coming back, on top of that, there's a moratorium which Vera has, because Vera obviously has to respect the sovereign government's requirements, has also implemented where you're not able to issue credits from Indonesia from forestry at this moment until that moratorium is lifted. So that's just like top level, right? Just to give you a very high level. So now you add on to that all of the 100 indices from a quality assurance process, you know, however you choose to, whether it's B0, whether it's sustained craft, etc. So what's happening though is it's causing what I will call a constipation in demand, because suddenly everyone is scared of doing not perfect, but it should somehow flip. So all I'm saying is, just from an investment perspective, the investment opportunities are definitely there, and the returns are good. If you have a long-term perspective, you're able to still generate forest carbon, you know, hopefully at $10 to $12 a ton cost, including all of the potential tax, including the implementation, the community on implementation of programs which have alternative livelihoods. However, you also just got to bear in mind that without demand, if the price currently is below $12, which in many cases it is, unfortunately, that then leads to unsustainable projects. And that's what we saw from 2011. So GFC happened in 2008. Everyone bailed, including some of our big investors, 2011. So there's just this very cyclical problem around energy crises, macros causing depletion of demand. So just coming back, I am actually suggesting to a large extent there should be commoditization, but there should also be, if there is a reforestation project, because reforestation is exceptionally extra effort to have to go through building a nursery, seedlings, investing in the actual planting, and then not really recouping the biomass growth until year 3 to year 5. So yes, there will be different price levels, but you should still be trying to have a base load commoditization where people don't get slammed or green shamed. I think that was a term I learned. I learn something new at every conference. Green shaming. Yeah. Anyway, so point that I'm making is supply is there, opportunities are there, ROI is good. So in these peat forests, which is avoided planned deforestation, there's really good returns. With some of the changes with AUD, it's a little bit more complicated, but they're there. But I think that to turn the question back to the integrity, which I have a feeling Good Carbon will talk about, it's really how do we make it not that it has to be perfect, but like I'm fine shopping at Walmart and Costco, good, but if you want to go, you know, shop at Tiffany's, fine. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, should we give time for the question at the back, or?
Yeah, let's go to the question at the back. Then we'll come to you, Jerome, and also we'll also have questions from the floor shortly. So if you do have questions, please bear them in mind. We'll come to you.
Hi, good morning. Thanks very much for this discussion. It's been fantastic. My name is Rob Fowler. I've been dancing in this place for a long time. 2 questions, if that's okay. The first question is about the NDCs. Countries that have NDCs and large forest estates often don't have the inventory systems to report their every year, every 5-year forest stock changes. So how does that physical constraint or the information constraint work with forest projects in those countries? That's the first question. The second one is about biodiversity. Lots of friends meeting in Montreal right now, beautiful city, crazy cold compared to here. And they're talking about biodiversity credits, they're talking about how you measure this, what are the units, is it per hectare, how does it work? How do you think the information you need to get those benefits will work for the forest projects you're doing? The information flows are all about carbon. What else needs to be put in there for biodiversity? Sorry, two questions, sorry.
Thanks, Rob. So the first question was on sort of the ability to monitor emissions registries. Leslie, it looked like you wanted to... Did you want to take that one?
Sure.
Go for it.
Sure. Great questions. Hi, Rob. Haven't seen you in a while. So I don't think there's a single answer for your question regarding how countries, sort of in the absence of having high quality, not only FRELs, of which most countries have FRELs, but for those of you who love to look at geeky technical stuff, you'll notice that there are some that are great and that have been done well and could be used for more market-based accounting with credibility, but many more than not couldn't be, or basically that's the exception. And I don't think there's an answer yet, because if you think about even doing a subnational program, project yes, but subnational program, and you do market-based accounting, maybe you use the VERA JNR standard, maybe you use the AFLU standards under the VCS, but use the whole jurisdiction or province or state, and you have really high quality spatially explicit accounting to be able to do good quality accounting. But when the country goes to report their NDC, are they using that? And then the answer is no. So there's definitely a mismatch, and which is why you brought up the question. So I do think hopefully over time, there may be a top-down and a bottom-up evolution to ensuring that a country, even if it's sort of a patchwork across regions or jurisdictions, have unified accounting between the money that's coming in, that's generating verified emission reductions and removals that are being financed by private sector and delivered, even if they stay in the country, are using the same accounting that ultimately the country uses for their NDC, which I think is your question, right?
Can I maybe just build on what you said? And I would like to bring the future a little bit to the present, because I think the solution for such an interoperable inventory management system is technically relatively simple to do. Yeah. Right? And I think the treasure which nations are sitting on in terms of letting nature stand and not taking nature down is valuable, especially if you can attract foreign investment and if you can basically use nature also to fulfill your NDCs, and if you can also fuel a voluntary domestic market. And eventually, I think it will require the detachment of the issuance bit and the registry bit, right, which is today one in many cases. And blockchain technology, for example, is a great way to enable such a. You're laughing. It's a great way to build a highway, let's call it, which is essentially connecting those different systems in a very simple and also cost-efficient manner. And I think the time to do that is now and soon.
Does anybody want to take the biodiversity question, or?
Sure. Yeah, I can. Do you want me to start?
Please, please.
Yeah, I think there's really two elements to the question around biodiversity credits. One is the measurement, the thinking about how do you compare different biomes, different ecosystems, and how do you figure out the wealth of biodiversity, how to map that in a way that is accurate. I mean, it's only been 15 years that we've had high quality publicly available data sets for deforestation, the Hansen data set out of the University of Maryland. And so having similar technologies for biodiversity, that would be great. It does not necessarily follow that the monitoring, and the better MRV systems, that then needs to become a separate kind of credit. People are still quite, I think, taken with the idea of, hey, we're going to sell this thing, it's going to be a token, it's going to be super. I think in my view, we already have this wonderful infrastructure for finance to protect forests, which also happens to be where the biodiversity lives. So I think that there's a world where we can think about taking the best of the monitoring and using that to augment and build upon the forest carbon credit systems that already exist to keep growing the market and to make it relevant for a wider set of buyers.
That is awesome, because I get to have a very oppositional perspective. So I personally think that the biggest travesty is that CCS, which grabs CO2 and sticks it into a hole, has a 10x more higher price than amazing biodiverse rainforests being conserved because of a thing called permanence. You know, whereas I see permanence as just needing to buy 30 years, some people think that they need 10,000 years. So just coming back, I think there has to be a separate unit of measurement. If you're interested, check out CDC Biodiversité. They have their mean species average, which we don't necessarily agree with, but check it out. Check out IBAT. So this is a new tool that's been released with IUCN. Again, we agree with some parts of it. There's some new categorization of different biomes. So clearly there are areas which have far higher biodiversity and therefore should have a higher valuation. And so the way we're approaching it is 3 technologies. You can use eDNA. So they've now run tests where you put an eDNA measure from Oxford Nanopore into a river, and you can actually measure the individual DNAs of a kakapo, which is a specific species. So you can actually measure eDNA, and they're now doing aerial eDNA through the air. You can also use acoustic tracking or acoustic traps, and these can now run for 18 months with batteries, and you can even use SwarmX, which is now a SpaceX company, to send that data through IoT, and you can also use camera traps. And through these types of mapping on a concession, and we're trying to experiment with this, you can actually define what are base load biodiversity levels, and is it 1% up, 1% down. And the way that we look at it is eventually smart contract, issuing units based on blockchain, and Oracle bringing data on chain. But we don't need to go there yet. Obviously, there's a technical implementation that's still lacking, but absolutely feel that there will be some form of biodiversity unit, because the TNFD, which is coming out, the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures, run by Tony Goldner, they're releasing the same reports. That's a sister report to the TCFD, which has resulted in all of this funness. So just coming back, there will be a biodiversity credit, I'm strongly of the opinion of. We've also seen the Wallacea guys have done a great white paper. We've done a white paper. We don't agree necessarily 100% with the Wallacea Foundation, because they're actually advocating that it's almost, I don't mean to use the word incorrectly, but socializing it in some ways, like it's a socialist approach, meaning if you get carbon, you shouldn't also get biodiversity. Whereas we think that if you've got a treasure trove of DNA and genomic and biodiverse forest, you should actually be valued for that, as opposed to an acacia plantation or a CCS project. And then lastly, what we're also doing is, we've got an amazing project in Kalimantan with an amazing partner. They have DIACs and indigenous medicine. We're sending ethnobotanists out there, because if there's another ayahuasca, if there's another psilocybin, if there's another iboga, if there's another plant medicine or pharmaceutical value, no different to the fever tree, which began like, you know, this whole story around quinine and malaria. You know, and I say this because actually my chief carbon officer is in a coma right now, just returning out of our projects in Congo, where he contracted a very virulent strain of malaria. So I'm just saying, these projects are not easy. It's a lot of work, it's hard, but the treasures inside of the forests, I mean, it's real. So it's biogenomic, it's biodiversity, but it's more than carbon. And it shouldn't just be lumped together in carbon that's then valued at a 99% discount to someone sucking CO2 out of the earth and putting it under because of geothermal energy. Thank you very much. I'm off my soapbox.
Actually, though, but it's really exciting to hear what you're doing. Can I add one thing?
Yeah, by all means,
Pragmatic?
and then we'll go to Jerome.
Okay. No, it's Simon's panel.
You go, Leslie, and then we'll go to Jerome.
Okay.
And then we'll go to questions from the floor if there are further questions.
So thank you for bringing up all those exciting things you're doing on biodiversity. And I agree 100% that there will be a biodiversity credit that could trade alongside, separate from carbon. But there is a pragmatic way to do that now if one wanted to, using our market standards. You could take the CCB, the Climate Commitment Biodiversity Standard, is extremely flexible for how you define the indicators that you have. And you could potentially unitize the way you actually monitor and define your monitoring units within that standard. You know, whether that becomes the ultimate fancy, cool way to do it, but one could do it that way. So there is a pragmatic approach to capturing, unitizing, and measuring the generation of biodiversity units, using some of the really cool things that you talked about. So.
I just wanted to take that question maybe to link back to the topic of commoditization, right? Because we have heard earlier that commoditization in that market could lead potentially also to higher liquidity and demand. I would like to express the complete opposite point, because eventually what I think we want is more projects to come off the ground, right? And the project cost structure in most cases is very different from one to the other project, whether you have to buy land, you don't have to buy land, whether you want to have social income for local communities, whether you don't, whether you want to have biodiversity impact or not. So the cost structure is very different project by project. And I think the good news is that companies are willing to pay for it. So if you look at the regulatory pressure which is coming in Europe from the European taxonomy, it's basically asking companies to disclose what impact they're having along 6 dimensions, which is climate change adaptation, mitigation, but also biodiversity and all sorts of others. So the trend which we see, at least in many parts of Europe and among the investor base which we serve, which are large and mid-sized companies, is long-term conscious, differentiated climate action versus just doing basically unconscious reactive stuff and buying commodity projects. And I think that's a good news for all projects in Asia also and project developers, because you can price quality differences properly into the carbon price or the biodiversity credit price or whatnot.
Thanks, Jerome. So I'd like to see if there's any questions from the floor. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. We only have a few minutes left, so now is the time. But if not, I'm going to build on a point you raised there, Jerome, about investors wanting long-term conscious action. And then I want to link that with Article 6, because we have this uncertainty. We have rules on Article 6, but still uncertainty on the real, how it will operationalize. So how do you balance that long-term, or the need for long-term action and sort of stable income, stable investment flows with this policy uncertainty we have around Article 6 or other policy uncertainty on domestic markets? How can you balance that uncertainty? Is that something that we can manage in contracts? Is that something the registries have a role to play through tagging? Who has any thoughts on that? Georgie.
I have a quick one, then I'll hand it over to my esteemed colleague Leslie, who, after a gin and tonic, will tell you in a much more vigorous way how she feels about this question. For me, I think, in spite of the uncertainty, we just have to charge in. So we're going long. We are going all in 2023. So we have 6 large-scale projects in Congo, Guinea-Bissau, Indonesia, and we just think that 2025 market will start clearing up a little bit because of Corsia, etc., and then there's going to be reporting for Paris. So we're overcoming the uncertainty by closing our eyes. We're just going all in, and we're hoping that it'll sort itself out. But we're ranking our investable projects based on the potential ROI. But now, for the main event, introducing Leslie, view of Article 6, intersecting with VCUs. Thank you very much.
You're killing me. You're killing me, Smalls. So what my friend over there is referring to is an animated discussion we had last night with our friend at Vera, which was a good discussion, at least I thought so, but maybe he didn't. Anyway, but to frame around that, what are we doing about the long-term, like having long-term commitments for investment? Like our pool's 17 years, that's a long time. I'll probably be dead by the time it's over, right? But how are we handling the uncertainty and the ability to change? And I can kind of walk through a few of those things. So within our pool, we have the ability to evolve from what we have today, which is relative clarity that you can do a voluntary transaction. You don't want to double count, so this is what we talked about last night. So if our main goal of the pool in the short term is to provide funding for host countries who have conditional NDCs that they don't have the money to finance. So that's our goal. And to be able to count that we need to make sure it's not double counted. Our pool investors are willing to say that they will never use it in any other country's NDC. So contractually, we do that today. When we got into a discussion last night about how can you ensure that when that unit is issued and delivered to that buyer that has a contractual obligation not to use it in any NDC, nor to on-sell it to somebody that would, it's called a limited use right, that particular serialized ton has a tag that says this has been, will be, it may not always be, but will be used by the country. So working with the registries to be able to tag that so that as that might trade around the system, that you know that it could never be used in another country's NDC. That's what we were talking about last night, right? The other thing is within our pool, we have this evolution of change of standard. So if the standard changes and that requires something else besides just proof of corresponding adjustment, you have to be able to change what you're actually delivering for that, as well as change of law. So law being generally recognized by a country, not recognized under Paris. So, and then a similar asset. So all of our pricing, like I said, is market-based. Well, is the market price for that asset for one with or without a corresponding adjustment? So using those different knobs within our contractual terms, we're hoping to be able to navigate relatively smoothly this transition into a path which I believe there will be credits that are NDC credits, i.e. staying in the country, and those which will at some point have a path towards and get a corresponding adjustment. So I don't know if that addressed anything. Dorje, was that what you wanted me to say? Or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the assumption is it shouldn't hold you back from investing, but there are some countries which are clearly not going to need their own credits. So for example, Indonesia is tough because they've made voluntary, mandatory NDC commitments on forestry, which may cause some potential challenges to voluntary credits that come out. But there are some countries we operate in, say Guinea-Bissau, there's no chance they're going to need that carbon. So we're highly likely to be able to get a corresponding adjustment attached. So that's just another factor to factor in when you look at the investability. My question actually was for our colleague from Japan. I was really interested to just know, what do Japanese voluntary buyers want? And if I have any of them?
Here.
Yeah, what do they look for? What do voluntary buyers in Japan currently want to buy?
I'm not sure whether I can be a right person to answer that question. You are talking about renewable? Okay.
No, voluntary credits.
Okay,
like,
voluntary credits.
is that what you do the assessment of voluntary
okay,
credits?
Okay.
Is that your...
So, okay, let me add just one thing, right? So, commoditization sounds great, and I think we need to scale the market in that way. So I completely agree with you. So, and what we need to have in a market, so which is very preliminary understanding what voluntary carbon market is. So that's one thing. And then another thing is, I think, when we've been working under a variety of voluntary carbon market registry, so some projects disclosing a large amount of information, and some projects are not, right? So, so that's not very much a thing we are struggling for. So we need some transparency, some level of, I think, disclosure at the same level across the whole registry, right? So with those kind of, I think, preparation or infrastructures, I think we get more confident to purchase voluntary carbon credit. But that's my personal thought. I'm not sure whether I can answer your question.
I guess what I mean is, are they buying nature-based solutions, forestry, renewables, any countries that they like? It was more just understanding that.
That's okay. Let me think about that and get back to you shortly after this conference. I think I have to gather some information from my colleague.
No problem. Thank you.
1 year old. 1 year old. Next year, you're going to know the answer.
So we're coming to the end of the session. We just have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to come to Brian, though, just on that question around Article 6. And because I imagine that platforms like Climate Impact X exchanges have a role to play here. I mean, actually, I was wondering, do you offer products on your exchange that go out 5, 6, 7 years into the future and therefore span this period of uncertainty where rules are emerging? And if you do, how do you handle that uncertainty through the exchange?
Not yet. We're primarily focused on spot. Auctions seem hard enough to start with. I think for us, really the Article 6 and the Paris Agreement only have so much to do with the voluntary market. The voluntary market, it's voluntary. It's based on SBTI and TNFD and any number of different sort of more or less can you say things that are nice without NGOs getting mad at you. And so there is some regulatory overlap, particularly in the US and Europe, but it is primarily it's codes of conduct and it's companies finding their way. And I think, and the handful that are out there right now that are buying carbon credits that have included this in their sustainability strategies, they're out on a limb. And I think there's only so much clarity that can come, or additional opportunities that can come from Article 6. You know, the 6.4 mechanism, that's going to be a different kind of set of credits they can buy. Correspondingly adjusted credits is a different kind of credit, but ultimately it's up for each company to see how they want to navigate this market and how they find it being valuable to them. For us, is we're really looking to is engaging this in two ways. One is as corresponding adjustment credits become available, pricing them accurately such that countries know how they can think about including that finance to achieve their NDCs and their climate goals. And then two is looking at the different new opportunities and new mitigation opportunities in particular that are available to help, that can be funded and supported through carbon credits that can help countries achieve their NDCs. I mean, the forests, there's a lot of interest in that. Cook stoves, you know, there's sort of well-established markets for those. But there's any number of new opportunities, for example, credits from changing rice cultivation practices, changing land use practices, there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's nobody that's really focusing on, or rather there's a lot of opportunity to scale, but there's less emphasis on those right now that we are really focused on to help scale the market as a whole.
Thanks, Brian. So we've come to the end of the session. The timer that I see up on the stage here has gone red, which probably tells me that we need to wrap things up. But I think it was a really interesting session. I think there's huge potential here, huge potential for growth in the market, potential for a huge ramp up in emissions reductions through nature that, of course, is so needed if we're to have any chance of hitting Paris Agreement targets, excuse me, domestic targets. So a lot of work to do, but it would be boring if it was simple. So I think this is an exciting space, and I hope everyone stays engaged in this topic. And please join me in thanking my panelists today.